all of a sudden Canada starts becoming a multicultural place, right? A multi-ethnic place as well, you could say. Unfortunately, in Canada's history, many Indigenous people are forced to assimilate through residential schools. They had limited and reduced access to their language. The Indian Act did a lot to ban Indigenous cultural practices and traditions and spiritual practices. So it's really kind of sad if you think about it that in Canada's history, our government in the past and the people who lived here in the past, they looked at this group that was very different to them, that had very unique, practices and whatnot and beliefs, and they assimilated them. They forced them out of their language, culture, and traditions to a great extent. And it's very easy for us to sit here and moralize and say like, oh, that was a terrible thing to do, but unfortunately, 50, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that was kind of the standard thing to do. So it's actually a good thing that we exist now, because now is a very peaceful time to be alive, generally speaking. Obviously, so there are some places in the world where it's a war zone, but for the most part, if you were to go to a country where you look very different than everyone else, it's not going to be that bad. They're not going to kill you on sight. We have modern medicine, which allows you to which ensures that you don't get deadly diseases, perhaps, right? Hopefully, obviously, you can still get a deadly disease. What are your thoughts on this third point? The Immigration Act of 1919 required all immigrants to pass an English literacy test, not French. Do you think that that's important right now? Should people come into Canada be proficient in English?
Yes.
Yeah.
Generally think so. Does anyone kind of disagree? Do you think that? No. Is there any circumstances where it might be okay that we bring someone into Canada who doesn't speak English very well?
Yeah.
Okay, you're shaking your head yes. Can you think of some situations?
If they need help or they're in danger.
If they need help, they're in danger.
There needs to be a translator for anything.
We need a translator,
Or also like, never mind, that would work more if she could know both languages. But like, a person, it could also like maybe teach it.
Okay, so someone with a unique skill set,
Yeah.
right?
Or bring someone.
I think immigrants into Quebec could probably maybe only be able to speak French fluently. Like if you're from like Haiti or wherever.
Ah, okay, so you're saying we should add that, hey, let's say you want to go to Quebec, and maybe you're from a country that was a former colony, so you speak French, so we should add in the French aspect as well, okay, right?
You don't have to speak English because there's a lot of different groups that might speak that language, and you have to learn English as you go.
Okay, Canada's a multicultural place. You can still find access to groups of people who might speak your language, whatever that language happens to be, right? And it's tricky because like, is that something we want to promote? Like, do we want people eventually learning English?
Yes.
Right. Do you think that it's wrong to do that? Maybe, maybe not, right? It's very useful if you live here and you speak English because you have access to, most of how the culture functions. What she was saying at the back earlier, some of the circumstances where we might be okay where someone comes to Canada and they don't speak English well could be like a refugee situation, right? They're fleeing a war, they're fleeing some sort of conflict or some horrible issue. Maybe those people don't stay in Canada permanently, but if people want to move to Canada permanently, should you guys and girls think that they should be able to speak at least English or French, one of the two? Or trying to learn? If they're trying to learn, should we spend taxpayer dollars providing classes, or should they have to work and pay for those classes? What do we think?
Depending on the situation.
Depends on the situation, both of you? What?
Well, see if it's a group of people, then maybe you would fund it, but if it's just you, and it's more if you need to move into a country, then you fund it, or like it's like if you want, it's just a decision.
Okay, so let's say you talk about groups and a need. So let's say like the Ukrainian people who are fleeing from the war, who come here seeking refuge, maybe we help them because they're in a bad situation. So we help finance it. as opposed to someone just migrating here because they, you know, maybe they're a skilled worker. Like, okay, like, hey, you gotta, I don't know, as they would say, you know, pull yourself up from the bootstraps kind of thing. Okay, that's reasonable. What did you want to say anything?
Like pretty much what he said, if they need it, then I think they should pay for it, but if they can go to like a better job or something, they should like pay for it.
Right, similar situation. So one of the challenges with, you know, if you kind of try to maintain your identity after you migrate somewhere, is you might experience this thing called marginalization, right? What marginalization is when you're kind of pushed to the edges, right? You're isolated. It's the exclusion of people from social, political, or economic standpoints. So if someone does move here and they don't have access to English, you know, they're gonna be marginalized socially, right? Imagine if we had a student in the class and they couldn't speak English at all. How would you communicate with this person? You have no idea, you can't. You could actually use Google Translate. I did that once with someone who spoke Greek.
Greek?
Yeah. This a couple of years ago, I was in university. There was a little girl at a bus stop, clearly lost. Turned out she didn't know how to speak English. She had no idea where she was. She'd been missing for a couple hours. And I helped her out, helped her find a place where she could wait for her parents. She pointed out to me that, hey, we can Google Translate. So I would type a sentence in English, it would translate to Greek. She would read it, she'd respond back. And so we had a communication. So that's how I found out that she was lost and didn't know where her parents were. So it's possible, but do you think that a lot of people are going to communicate like that on a regular basis? Probably not, right? I'll let you fill in the notes before I kind of add more questions for discussion. Sometimes, unfortunately, people get marginalized for, what is the word? For arbitrary reasons. So some people might get marginalized because they look different, because they sound different, you know, because they practice a different religion, right? Which is particularly now in current times, you know, we look at that as very bad. Like, why would you marginalize someone for their skin color or for the language they speak? But historically, like that second point states there with colonization, you know, people would marginalize these differences because they didn't want to adapt, let's say, perhaps, or it was just too different for them to accept, which meant for that marginalized group of people that they might lose their land, they might lose, you know, their resources, they might become disenfranchised, lose the right to vote, lose the right to participate. Okay. Do you think marginalization is always a bad thing? You know, like, let's say, like, excluding groups or people, is that always a bad thing? Yes? Is there any groups of people that we exclude for perhaps good reasons? Did you say Russians?
Yes.
No, what? Oh, okay, that's a good point, right? So maybe Russian people felt marginalized when the war was going on, right? So what was the response from the world when Putin and Russia's army invaded Ukraine? What's that? Russians are all bad? All Russians are bad, perhaps? What do you kids know what the different world economies did, different countries? They stopped trading with Russia, right? The ruble, their currency crashed because everyone said, oh, you're doing something terrible. Well, we're not going to play with you anymore. And so their currency crashed, right? So that might be an example where marginalization could have been a good thing, although there's a lot of like innocent Russians perhaps who got screwed over by that. And then any Russian who is living elsewhere, let's say second, third generation Canadians, you know, maybe they got marginalized, and that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Like, just because you're from that ethnic group, doesn't mean you're to blame for actions for other people, right? Like that's a form of stereotyping or, you know, potentially even racism. Right? Is there any other time we could think of where marginalization might be a good thing? Do you think prisons are a form of marginalizing people?
Yeah.
Right? Lock them away for good reasons, perhaps, right? Some cultures even think that prisons are bad. Right? So I know some of the Scandinavian countries, their prison system is very different to ours, right? Anyone been to a jail?
Us?
I've been to like a
You
old
have?
one.
You've seen the inside of one?
Like a really old one.
Well, we'll ask her and we'll hear from you, okay? What was, do you want to share your experience? What was it like?
Scary.
Scary? Did it look like a fun place to be? Right? Not a fun place to be? You saw a very old prison?
Yeah, like on a field trip. It was just a small little place with old rusty bars. It was like, I
Do you have a
see-
story?
My uncle, he's like a cop. He's like a veteran.
Okay, let's make sure we're listening.
And like it was like 2 kids worked there, but his kids were like at camp, so we took them instead, and I got to like see it, and it was like so scary. There were like a lot of really big people there.
Some very large men. Yeah. Yeah, so in our society, you know, we marginalize people maybe because they committed a crime, right?
I saw them.
But, you know, we might want to marginalize groups of people that maybe